In the agenda, it says the concluding remarks, next steps by John Trent. So I've actually written a bit of a paper here, which Joe keeps asking me to cut down. And so it's called Getting from A to B. How do we go about creating workable global institutions? And that's the issue I want to address for the next few minutes. On June the 16th, 2015, last June, the report of the Commission on Global Security, Justice and Governance was launched at the Peace Palace in The Hague. In presenting their report, co-chair Ibrahim Gambari noted, quote, I quote, "The United Nations and global governance institutions are ill-suited to address many modern evolving threats and must reform or risk prolonging and deepening global crises." Seems to me that says it. According to co-chair, former U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, the world requires, quote, "more capable tools of global governance with different kinds of public, private, and, here we are, public, private, and mixed institutions designed for 21st century challenges." So it looks like they're certainly approving our plans of moving ahead. The report acknowledged that we need a longer-term approach to global governance reforms and a transitional strategy that includes building coalitions to initiate and nurture reforms and to marshal, monitor, and sustain support for the reform agenda. Now, this conference has been held in part to fill that gap with the introduction of our Workable World Conference ideas, saying that creative thinkers have and are putting forward numerous workable proposals for dealing with the major threats now facing humanities. So I should also notice that one thing is that we are not alone in our endeavors to create a workable world. For instance, a small but growing number of scholars have joined together to form a world government research network to be found at www.greresearch.org. Okay? So they would be delighted to hear from any of you that wish to participate in that effort. Our conference has spelled out the nature of world problems and potential solutions. This is all well and good, but we should admit to ourselves that we have been talking about many of these topics, and many more, for a good number of years now. To date, we appear to have more plans than we do realizations, with a few notable exceptions, such as the founding of the International Criminal Court. In this lack of practical reforms, we do not seem to be totally alone either. Let me give you one example. Maggie Black, the author of International Development, Illusions and Realities, wrote a couple of weeks ago, a week ago, recently wrote a short article about the 15,000-word report for the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and their dizzying 169 targets. She called it a monument to mushiness and wishful thinking, and asked if statesmen and bureaucrats live in an international fairyland. She pointed out that, and I quote again, there is nothing in the agenda to say how to bring about this peaceful, just, and sustainable developing world. And that, of course, is my very point. I've come to the conclusion that many of our problem, that part of our problem is that we have not stopped to ask ourselves about the how rather than the what. In other words, we work so hard defining what needs to be changed, reformed, or transformed that we forget to ask ourselves how we're going to get into a reform mode. How are we going to get to bring about new global institutions? How are we going to, as I say, get from A to B? And this, it seems to me, is the essence of the topic I've been assigned these closing remarks. What are our next steps for moving towards a workable world? Getting into a reform mode is neither simple nor simplistic. In fact, once we open the Pandora's box, we see it as rather complex. So this is what I want to do for a few minutes. I just want to peek inside Pandora's box to provide a brief glimpse of the rather prosaic tasks we must accomplish in our next conference. And we are planning a new conference within a year and a half. I have arranged these tasks under 6 headings, but I'm sure that everyone in the audience will find things that I have missed. So the first question is, what are the blockages to global reforms and how do we surmount them? That's where we have to start our thinking and our action. Why can't the UN make big, urgent decisions? In other words, what are the major obstacles we have to overcome if we want to launch new and improved global institutions? Surely, the most formidable obstacle is the dear old problem of sovereignty, the belief that each state can do as it wants with impunity. The 5 permanent members of the Security Council are intent on preserving their power and spheres of interest rather than promoting cooperation. Even so, we know that the responsibility to protect doctrine is starting to gnaw into the concept of absolute sovereignty. And there are numerous efforts to curb the total veto of the P5 and to make sure that new permanent members do not get a veto. The question, of course, then is, what sort of balance of forces will it take to get the P5 to let go of their powerful advantages? No use talking about this unless we come up with some proposals, and we've heard some here over this last 2 days. I said the United Nations needs to be fixed. What I really mean, though, is that the attitudes of states and peoples and short-sighted leaders about sovereignty and nationalism need to be changed. The Security Council veto is founded on the bully principle that the most powerful, not the community, should call the shots. But the rot of sovereignty spreads much more further throughout the United Nations. The root problem then is, first, that countries still put their own interests ahead of those of the world community, and second, national foreign policies are still elaborated by presidents and prime ministers acting as though they were monarchs. There are few democratic controls in the world or in our countries. How do we get populations to change their politicians? A major question for us. This is the major structural blockage to institutional change, but there are many more impediments. For instance, many of those who have operated the UN, what some call UN hands, like to tell us that our pie-in-the-sky dreams of radical reforms are neither necessary nor useful. The United Nations, according to these bureaucrats, is always in a process of reforming itself. For instance, at present, UN hands point to a considerable number of studies, commissions, conferences, and initiatives for global governance reforms that prove the United Nations is not standing still. This isn't the problem, of course. We all know that, but we have to be aware of this. There are 2 lessons here. We will have to be vigilant about current events that can upset the reformist apple cart. And even if we claim that these people who try to quash broad schemes of reform rarely stand outside the box themselves to see the big picture and to ask what the world is not, why the world is not working and why, they still have a stultifying capacity to block those who do try to promote structural reform. Secondly, We must be totally aware of the international context within which our reform efforts are being put together, and we must be prepared to deal with them. The third blockage comes from those who should be our allies, the cosmopolitanists. As international relation theorists, they doubt that real-world national sovereignty can be overcome. But they are also motivated by a positive fear of world government, which they argue must be centralized and despotic. The truth is that these thinkers have not gotten anywhere since the ideas of Immanuel Kant. Nevertheless, we must reassure them. We must show them that principles and values are fundamental, and that fears of creating an authoritarian global government must be displaced by the certainty that any new institutions will include all the techniques of democratic statecraft that we've developed over the last couple hundred years. Reform will not be easy. It will be opposed by those who have an interest in war rather than peace, those who feel secure within their narrow nationalism, and those who want to keep the ignorant mob outside of foreign policy decision-making. Second major question, and they get progressively shorter. How do we instigate thinking about a world constitution, values, norms, and principles? We will need to develop research, analysis, and workshops on the normative fundamentals required in the workable world order. In other words, what we're proposing when we're talking about new global institutions has got to be formed in the context of a new constitutional elaboration. You know, I don't know whether it'll be a new UN charter, but we have to think about the basic fundamental values, norms, principles that will underlie the new world order. So this amounts to initiating a global constitutional debate. What might a new UN charter for the 21st century look like? Should we seek a new set of globalist papers, as in federalist papers, by leading world thinkers to open up the debate on values and institutions required for a workable world? Certainly, we'll have to consider, among other subjects, evolving concepts of sovereignty, democracy, federalism, and human rights, the meaning of security, development, and authority at a world level, the purposes, objectives, principles of action, and membership rights and obligations for new world organizations, as well as the functions, powers, and domains of action and responsibility, and of course, rules of representation, voting, methods, and means of ratification. I hope that long list terrifies you, because it is the sort of thing that we are facing. Constitutional and democratic safeguards will include, and this I think is a point that we've all got to make to all those who doubt where we're going, they will include dividing and controlling power, promoting rights and equality, democratic institutions and processes, federalism, liberalism, rule of law, local police and militias, and decentralization. Also, as we have seen, we'll have to continue to update our understanding of the present and future context of world governance. Second, we might learn from the European Union's step-by-step model of gradually building common functional institutions. Third question, how are we going to envision new global institutions, rethinking global authority, institutions, and reform processes? Peace and security is only one of the elements of global governance, but they are its sine qua non. Consequently, the UN has had to develop a wide-ranging peace-building capacity, encountering many notable difficulties. We must study the successes and failures of world organizations during this period and see how we can better ensure peace and security. Surely, we want to go into greater depth and debate about all the reform topics brought up at this conference and are to be found in Joseph Schwartzberg's groundbreaking book. Transforming the United Nations System, Designs for a Workable World. In my own earlier book on modernizing the United Nations system, I went into considerable depth on institutional renewal and how to bring it about. So we will have to study what has already been written about the reform of international organizations to mine these works for seminal ideas. We will want to turn to specialists on the sociology of institution building, for instance. I've included in here 3 or 4 pages, which I'm not going to read, of references, of bibliography. And as going through them, I was struck by the extraordinary depth of knowledge that we've already built up and that we sometimes forget. So it's one of our first tasks, is to go over what we already know and bring out the gems. Then there's a question of principles, purposes, and functions of new institutions and the paths for attaining them. So, the 4th point is setting goals. We should take a lesson from the brilliant planning done for the original Millennium Development Goals. They showed that success depends on setting concrete agendas, targets, and indicators. Sometimes I worry about the UN. They always seem to take a really good idea and then mess it up. They really wanted to include every person and every group and every issue in the new goals. So, but we can go back to the original ones, and success depends on getting concrete agendas, targets, and indicators. For instance, consider the following conundrums. In what order or of priority should reform proposals be put forward? Now, Joe and I both have books on this, and we list many. Where do we start? With which ones? Which priorities? What is urgent and fundamental? Or, indeed, should what is fundamental be tackled after minor successes have been achieved? Who are the most important audiences to target, and in what order? For instance, do we attempt to convince state leaders first, or the general public opinion? Which leaders are the most important, political, economic, or social? Are these priority publics that should be targeted first? And how do we mobilize educators and communicators, talent, and develop the most convincing arguments? Well, enough said. The last point, 5. How do we build coalitions to initiate and nurture reforms and then marshal, monitor, and sustain support for the reform agenda? We have to bring together NGOs, former international practitioners, academics, former politicians, and potentially some government representatives and other informed and concerned global citizens to build on the knowledge and concepts that we are developing. To achieve this goal, we should study case histories like the campaigns for the International Criminal Court in landmines. What do we do about other potential participants like business, the arts, and religion? But the major task is to mobilize world opinion and to set in motion a process of reform of international organizations. We have to learn to recruit lead committees and supportive NGOs. Finally, how can we move the world ahead? Let us not neglect the all-important support of a small number of forward-looking governments. It has already been mentioned here about the small and medium-sized governments. Some might create workable world specialized programs in their ministries of foreign affairs and give them the resources to carry out the monumental task. These ministries would be seeking to advance global governance and encouraging like-minded countries to become partners. It is only states which have the personnel and finances to move us forward to more global, competent global institutions. Non-governmental organizations, us, we can try to plan, to push, and to prod to get the ball moving, but eventually some governments are going to have to buy in. At present, reforms to the United Nations and other global governance machinery are dealt with by governments on a piecemeal and usually narrow calculation of national interest. If such UN reform-focused programs were to exist in the government, they could become the focus of change. So, as I see it, our next step is to say to ourselves that our work after today is not finished. It has just begun. And I'm pleased to announce that the Workable World Trust will be helping to sponsor a new conference on creating workable world global institutions in a year or so. I take pleasure inviting everyone here who is interested in this topic and the outline of the agenda that I've made, and I hope that will include all of you, to help make our next step forward a great success. And I should tell you that we will be writing all of you with these proposals and asking for your participation.